Hi, I'm Pastor John. Our scripture reading today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verse 30 through 35. Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" Preaching on this morning's scripture passage could be compared to telling a joke that everyone has already heard. They already know the punchline. Likewise, this morning's scripture is so familiar that even people who have never read the Bible have heard about the Good Samaritan. So the surprise is lost, but rather than skipping it or thinking of it as just a worn-out cliche, this morning I wanted to visit the parable again and try to see it in the light of our own times and circumstances. Jesus told the story of a man who was traveling down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem is up in the hills of Judea at an elevation of 2,500 feet, and Jericho is 850 feet below sea level. So it's a steep descent from the mountains down into the valley on a trail with many switchbacks and turns. It was a dangerous route, and perhaps he shouldn't have been traveling alone, but he was, and he got mugged. He was beaten up. The thieves stripped him of his clothing, which was really a valuable commodity in that day, and stripped of his resources and his dignity. He was left there beside the trail to die. Then a priest came down the trail. The word "down" would indicate that his work in the temple in Jerusalem had been completed and he was heading home. Now, this is important because if he were heading up the trail, up to his work at the temple in Jerusalem, touching a dead man would have ceremonially defiled him and prevented him from doing his work. Not that it should have mattered. But Jesus eliminates that consideration by telling us that the priest was also heading down. In my imagination, I think of him as being a bit beyond middle age, perhaps a bit girthy, and having fulfilled his 2-week tour of service there at the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, I imagine that his face was just glowing and radiant from the rich religious experience that he had just enjoyed. As he walks along, I can imagine him quoting from the Psalms. "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go into the house of the Lord.' The Lord builds up Jerusalem. He gathers the outcasts of Israel. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." But then, as he rounds the corner, he sees the victim lying beside the road. The moment of crisis has arrived. What should he do? He chose to do nothing. Perhaps this was Jesus' subtle condemnation of religion that refuse to get involved with the problems or the messiness of life. In the book, The Survivors Club, Ben Sherwood writes of the 10-80-10 rule. He writes that in a sudden crisis, about 10% of the people will handle the crisis with a relatively calm, relatively rational state of mind. 80% will be stunned and surprised and bewildered. Their reasoning is impaired. Their brain freezes up. They don't know what to do. And then 10% will simply become hysterical. They'll start behaving in counterproductive ways. They'll start behaving inappropriately. They'll be making things worse instead of better. And he writes, those are the people you have to watch out for, because they can set the example for the 80% who don't know what to do. Of course, we would all like to think that we are among the 10% who would respond rationally. We hope that in a crisis we would be cool and calm and collected. We would like to believe that we would behave appropriately. I certainly hope that's true, but judging from the great toilet paper shortage of 2020 brought on by hoarding, we need to hold open the possibility that even rational people can act irrationally. Down through the years, this nation has experienced any number of financial panics leading to stock market crashes and banks closing. Once panic is in the air, watch out, be careful. So perhaps the priest and the Levite were among the 80% who, when confronted by a crisis, were shocked, and they just didn't know what to do, and they were not prepared, and so ultimately they did nothing. But it may have been Jesus' implication that since the priest and the Levite were people with some social status and position, that they overlooked this poor, beaten traveler as, well, unimportant, or someone that they could safely ignore. How convenient it is to overlook people we think might be mentally ill, or a drug addict, or a danger of some kind, or different than we are. Perhaps that's what the priest and the Levite did. Today, we are living in a time when a whole segment of the population has risen up to say that they must no longer be ignored or taken for granted. All lives matter. Black lives also matter, and their voices must be listened to rather than ignored. How can racism be dismantled in this country? It can only happen as we recognize the stereotypes and the prejudices, as well as the partial truth and the incomplete truths that we carry around inside of us. It's only as we are able to renounce the fear of the different people that we can move forward. When I was young, I drove old cars that were always breaking down, and I developed a real heart for people who were broken down by the side of the road. I would often stop to see if I could help, but times have changed. Cars no longer have a distributor with points and a condenser. They no longer have a carburetor. They're managed by onboard computers. I open the hood of a strange car and Man, I don't know what I'm looking at. And today, nearly everyone has a cell phone. They can call the AAA or someone who really knows how to help. A while back, I was headed to church on Sunday morning and I saw a beat-up old car by the side of the road with its flashers on, and I thought to myself, I can't go and worship God while ignoring the needs of my fellow man. So I pulled over. I stopped. The guy was surprised, but perfectly okay. He was delivering Sunday newspapers and had just pulled over to fold another 20 or 30 of them. Well, times have changed. Circumstances have changed. And perhaps the way we can help others has also changed. How has your heart been sensitized to help others? Japanese writer Haruki Murakami wrote, "Once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through or how you survived. You may not even be sure the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, you won't be the same person who walked in." That's what storms are all about. Hardships sometimes prepare ordinary people for extraordinary destinies. Back when I lived in Bucks County, I was a member of the local fire and rescue company, and the pager would just go off anytime, day or night. Sometimes they were just false alarms, but sometimes they were really intense situations. Moving here, that chapter of my life came to an end, but driving up Valley Forge Road one morning, I saw a little fire off beside someone's house. Okay, they must have had a fire pit. Maybe they have a burning barrel, but there was something about it that just didn't seem right. So I finally turned around and I drove back just to check it out. This guy had a big pile of trash out at the end of his house. Hard to believe here in Tredyffrin Township, but he did, and it was on fire. Oh, it was just a little fire. If I had a garden hose, I could have had it out in no time. But there was no garden hose. So I went and I banged on the door, and I had to argue with the guy about calling the fire department, getting everyone out of the house, moving his car to a safe distance. He didn't want to. It was just a little fire. It was no big deal. Yeah. But the rule of thumb is that a fire can double in size every 60 seconds. Well, he finally made the call, and the fire department responded quickly. But by the time they arrived, the fire had already spread to the built-in garage and the bedroom above on the second floor, and it was licking the roof on top of the house. The firemen had to tear out the walls to make sure it had all been put out properly. I hadn't done anything except to point out the obvious. But you know, I'm glad that I had been sensitized to see the obvious. So what is your passion? What is your purpose in life? Where has your heart been touched to feel the pain of others? What life experiences have you had that have sensitized you and prepared you to serve? Larry Lawton was a small-time hood in New York City. Eventually, he became a bookie and then moved into the ranks of organized crime. Eventually, he discovered something even more exciting, and that was robbing jewelry stores. In 7 years, he robbed 20 stores and netted over $15 million in diamonds alone. But it really wasn't the money that motivated him. It was the thrill. It was the excitement of the robbery, the rush of taking over the whole store and tying up the employees and reaping the harvest. Eventually, he made the FBI's most wanted list, which in his society was sort of like being named a valedictorian. But then it happened. He slipped up. He made a mistake and was caught and sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. He was put in solitary confinement for a full year, and he really thought the loneliness would make him lose his mind. And it might have. It might have, had it not been for the guy in the next cell who used to whisper through the air vent at night. And this contact with another human being kept him in touch with his sanity. But one night, the voice in the air vent said, "I love you, brother, but I'm checking out." And the next morning, Larry saw his friend, who had taken his own life, being wheeled away on a gurney. How could life possibly get any worse than this? To lose your only friend in this God-forsaken prison. And then he said it was like there was a silent voice inside him that said, "I have plans for you, Larry. I want to make sure that other kids don't end up in prison or like your dead friend." Now, it was an epiphany. It was a redefining moment in his life. And Larry dedicated his life to serving Christ. And when he finally got out of prison, he started a program for at-risk teens, working to lower their suspicion and connect them with resources and caring people in the community. One time he had taken pride in making the FBI's most wanted list. Now he takes pride in having been made an honorary policeman in the Lake Street Lewis Police Department. Many people watching this video have gone through really tough times. Some were traumatic, embarrassing, or very, very difficult. Perhaps it involved death or disease or divorce or mental illness or addiction or arrest or problems with your children or with your parents. You can fill in the blank. But if there is any good news in this, it's that God can use even our most terrible moments. God can redeem these bad times to help us to grow and to mature and to sensitize us to help others in their time of need. God can take our broken pieces and use them to make something useful. We read in Romans that we can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us to develop endurance and patience and strength of character and prepare us for service to others. So this Samaritan, who belonged to a despised race, lied about, rejected, picked on, insulted by the religious people of his day, had compassion on the man who was so very different from him and took the risk of helping him. I say risk because the robbers were probably nearby. They might even be using this victim as bait in an ambush. I say risk because if someone saw the Samaritan bending over a beaten Jew, they might think that it was the Samaritan that had committed the crime. I say risk because giving up his donkey to the beaten man would slow him down and make the trip through this dangerous place last even longer. The Samaritan cleaned and treated the man's wounds, put him on his own donkey, took him to an inn where he paid to have him cared for. Helping this stranger was going to be costly, but he knew in his heart that this was the right thing to do.